ready. So this will be number 6 and just an initiative to start to gather information from all of our network kind of clinicians and experts on different topics that are around kind of whole health. And so excited to have Dr. Dittus with us. She is one of the co-founders of Steps to Wellness, if some of you didn't know that. So I have a lot of our Steps to Wellness graduates and participants here as well. So she is who to thank for that. So I'm happy to send it over. I know she has lots to say, so I'm going to let her get started.
Awesome. Hello, Vermont. I miss you all. All right. So I'm Kim Dittus, and I'm now at the University of Wisconsin, but my heart is still in Vermont. So I'm a medical oncologist, and I happen to have a background in nutrition and have a PhD in nutrition. So talking about food is something I always enjoy doing. And as usual, if anybody has heard me talk about nutrition before, I'm confident I'm going to go too long. So sorry about that. Rebecca, you want to call up the first slide or start the sharing? Awesome. Yeah, so we're going to spend the next probably 55 minutes or so talking about food choice and cancer. So let's go to the next slide. And so these are the topics I want to get to. I want to start a little bit from where we're starting from in terms of food choice and recommendations. And the reason I sort of picked these pictures is I feel like when you hear about news on TV or in magazines and things like that, it just seems like it's such a windy path, and it really probably isn't all that windy. There's probably a pretty straight path in terms of what we will end up recommending. So we'll start from where we are. We'll talk about where we'd like to get and then how to get there. So, yep, next slide. So this is kind of where we are right now, and that is with our standard American diet. And as you can see, that kind of stands for SAD. And if you kind of look at that pie chart with where foods are coming from, it kind of pops out at you that 63% of the calories that we consume on a regular basis are from processed foods like sugars, refined grains, things like that. Another big chunk is 25% from animal foods. And then you see in green, that's where the plant foods are at about 12%. So really, this probably should be flipped to a large extent. Let's go on to the next slide. So what's the problem with this standard American diet? And so we'll first kind of look at what the potential impacts are on health. So there's some increased risk of some cancers, and not all cancers, but more so digestive tract cancers, prostate cancer, breast cancer. But the most common cause of death in the United States still is cardiovascular disease. So there's an increased risk of cardiovascular disease as well, increased risk of diabetes. It's associated with excess weight. But then there's some lesser known associations of our kind of standard American diet. And that is an increased risk of developing osteoporosis, worsening anxiety and depression symptoms, and even impaired cognitive function. So those are sort of lesser known associations. And why might that be? So if you are consuming a diet that has a lot of processed foods, in particular ultra processed foods, that's associated with increased inflammation. And it changes our gut microbiome, and we're learning so much about gut microbiome that could be a whole talk in itself. But it also crowds out healthier foods if we're consuming a lot of processed foods. It can contribute to metabolic problems like fluctuations in glucose and insulin and things like that. The other piece, especially related to weight gain, it's really palatable and it's easy to consume, easy to overeat processed foods. Next slide. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about excess weight. This is the only slide that I'm going to have on that. But excess weight is associated with developing certain cancers. And is it the weight itself, or is it the metabolic changes that are often associated with excess weight? That's really debatable. But an easy marker, biomarker, is weight. And the reason that it is likely or possibly related to certain cancers is that adipose tissue is not inert. It just doesn't sit there and do nothing. It can be associated with oxidative damage and inflammation, hypoxia, making it harder to get oxygen to certain tissues, and changes insulin response, but also changes how steroid hormones work as well. And all of those things then have downstream impacts on cell signaling and cell proliferation and cell survival and things like that. Next slide. So sort of going back now to that standard American diet again. So if you looked, it was about 63% that was processed, but really it's the ultra processed food that's a concern, and processed meat and possibly red meat. It also tends to contain excess sugar and simple carbohydrates, and you end up with an unbalanced ratio of certain types of fat. And then there's chemicals in some of those ultra processed foods that aren't found in nature. Our ancestors were not exposed to certain chemicals that we are now. And then probably an even more important point is this bliss point idea that some manufacturers design their food to have the right combination of sugar, fat, salt, and mouthfeel to promote us to continue to eat. And that's what they call the bliss point. So then what's missing then? So what that has crowded out is plants. So vegetables, fruits, legumes, beans, nuts, and seeds. But also, if you're not including those plants, then you are having fewer vitamins and minerals. You're having less healthy fat, less fiber, and less phytonutrients. Next slide. So I think it really is worth drilling down on what processed really means. And so unprocessed would be how food is found in nature, and that would be just washing. And it was generally highest in nutrients and fiber. But then, decades ago, people started canning foods and freezing foods and things like that. And that was an awesome way to preserve vegetables, fruits, and things like that. And so we started down this whole processing road for really good reasons. So some processing is fine. If you have frozen foods, canned foods, they still contain almost all of the essential nutrients. And in some situations, flash frozen in the field has even more vitamins and minerals than so-called fresh foods. But the issue is these ultra processed foods, and those are foods that are usually from corn, soy, and wheat. They usually have added fat. They don't look like anything we would find in nature. You couldn't make those at home. And I think that that is a good way to sort of decide whether something is ultra processed, is if you look at the label and you can't reproduce that at home, then that is generally an ultra processed food. Next slide, thanks. And those, where are those found? They're primarily found in breads and breakfast foods, that's 27%, and then fats and condiments, and then packaged sweets, snacks, and desserts. And you can see that 2/3 of that circle are foods that are pretty easily eaten and easy to overeat on. And then there's a variety of other foods that would be considered ultra processed in things like ready to eat things, packaged snacks, some yogurts and things like that. Next slide. So I'm going to take a little bit of a diversion here. So let's look at the impact of ultra processed foods on health. So if you look at epidemiologic data, which is a type of research that follows people over time and looks at what sort of things they're consuming and what they're doing, epidemiologic data suggests that ultra-processed food increases the risk of diabetes by 25%. And that seems like a lot. And so this is where I want to break down a little bit some of the news flashes that we get about things increasing whatever by 25, 50%. what does that's in sort of a population level. What does that mean sort of for an absolute risk or for an individual? So the way that you can break that down is that if on average, the number of people who develop diabetes in a year for for every 1,000 individuals, 5.9, there will be 5.9 new cases of diabetes. And if someone in that population, if the people in the population are consuming a high level of ultra processed food, so that group of people, they would, the incidence of new diabetes diagnoses would be 7.4. So I feel like sometimes things are really sensationalized on the news, and it's important to step back and say, what is the real absolute risk of that? So it is true that if you go from 5.9 per thousand to 7.4 per thousand, that is a 25% increase. But you can see that the number of people that impacts isn't as large as that 25% implies. And that is not to say that nutrition data and 25% doesn't mean anything. It really does. I just want all of us to always have a little bit of skepticism when we're seeing sensationalized news reports and things like that. So yes, thank you. So to go on then, there's a 25% increased risk of diabetes, about a 23% increased risk of depression, and 21% increase in excess weight, and in particular excess weight in the abdominal area, and some association with increasing the likelihood of dying from any cause, whether it's cancer, cardiovascular disease, whatever. But none of that, the evidence is not as strong for cancer when you control for excess weight. So just to sort of put that into perspective a little bit. All right, next slide. So why might ultra-processed food choices contribute to that? And this is kind of similar to what we've already talked about. If the majority of your diet is ultra-processed, you're going to be consuming fewer micronutrients. It's going to be lower in fiber. It's usually lower in protein, but not always. It's often higher in sugar because that encourages us to eat more. And then you have the blood sugar spikes and the insulin spikes and things like that. It's often higher in saturated fat. It's overall, there are fewer health protective phytonutrients. And there's an increase in these substances, these xenobiotics. That's a terrible sounding term, but these are substances our bodies really haven't seen before until the last, several decades. All right, next slide. And then probably more important is the fact that ultra-processed food is so easy to eat. It's hyperpalatable. We talked about the bliss point. There's data to suggest that ultra-processed food really sort of enhances that sensation of food reward. It also kind of messes up our ability to nutrient sense. So there's some data to suggest that there's a certain amount of nutrients, in particular probably protein, that we are shooting for, that our body knows to kind of shoot for. And if that is interfered with ultra-processed food, that's harder. It changes our appetite and satiety, and it's very energy dense and easy to digest. All right, I feel like I'm beating up on ultra-processed food, and I think that's okay. So this is, to me, it's an older study at this point, but still probably the best done study comparing ultra-processed food choice to an unprocessed diet. It was a very controlled trial. This is not epidemiologic data like we had talked about before, but they had 20 subjects, and all those individuals had all of their food provided at a research center. They couldn't get any food anywhere else. It was all provided there. And they each received 2 different diets. One was an ultra-processed diet. The other was an unprocessed diet. And they were on that diet for 2 weeks. Then there was a little bit of a washout period, and then they switched. Now, this is a diet that the food choices that were presented to them had about the same amount of protein, carbohydrates, fat, that sort of thing, but individuals were able to pick what they wanted to eat. All right, next slide. And this is a little bit about of what it would look like. So the ultra-processed diet, you see the hot dogs, the chips, the sugar-sweetened yogurt, and some sort of drink there. And then on the other side, that's fish and broccoli and salad and potatoes and things like that. So that's just an example of the different types of food that they were able to select from. Next slide. Yeah, and here is the results. So when individuals were consuming the ultra-processed diet, and that's represented by the blue line, they consumed 500 more calories a day. And the next graph, you'll see that over that 2-week period, they almost gained 2 pounds. And that's a fair amount of weight gain in just 2 weeks. So that is one of the main impacts. And then they have other information about how fast they were able to consume those foods and how the speed of consuming ultra-processed foods contributed to excess calories and things like that. All right, next slide. So I always hesitate putting this in, but I think sometimes we have this idea that it's okay to have ultra-processed foods, and yeah, it is. But I think that and Drew Carey is, as some of you know, an actor who has lost a lot of weight, and I think he's kind of hit on something, that eating crappy food isn't necessarily a reward; it's a punishment. All right. So then there's a few specifics that I think are worth drilling down because they get brought up a lot in terms of cancer, and that is sugar. Does sugar cause cancer? So sugar is not a carcinogen, and you see on the slide there the chemical structure of sucrose, which is the most common disaccharide, most common sugar that we have. It's not a carcinogen. But some cancer cells metabolize glucose faster than normal cells. It's called the Warburg effect. Not all cancer cells. And what we do know is that a sugar-enriched diet promotes tumor growth in mice. That does not necessarily mean that that is the case in humans. And so then when you kind of drill it up to a human, we are then left with epidemiologic data again, because there's no large randomized control trials. And what we know is that sugar-sweetened beverages, there's a small association with increases in colorectal cancer. I see that spelled wrong. Recurrence. So that's the cancer that we have the most data on. But the thing about the sugar, it's probably not the sugar itself. It's probably the fact that any excess simple carbohydrate, sugar or other simple carbohydrate, increases palatability, contributes to hyperinsulinemia and weight gain. So that's probably more the issue than it is the sugar itself. But it is true, next slide, that we have increased our overall consumption of sugar. So this is US sugar consumption from 1822 to 2005. So you can see the significant increase in the amount of sugar consumption. And if you look at all the sugar produced, and supposedly we are consuming 70 pounds a year. Now, obviously, some of that is thrown away. So there's no way to totally accurately estimate that. But if you break that down, that's about 30 teaspoons. And where is it found? In the same places that we have already talked about, but more so with the pure sugar, it's more in beverages. And the amount that we should be consuming is about 6 teaspoons a day if you are a female, and about 9 teaspoons a day if you're a guy. All right. And then what about sugar alternatives? Well, most sugar alternatives are still sugar. I like maple syrup, and honey is great as well. And they have a few trace minerals, but it still essentially acts the same way in your body as regular table sugar. Coconut sugar, maybe a little bit lower glycemic index, probably not enough to make a difference. And then I do kind of like the idea in baking to substitute dates and applesauce, because you're getting some fiber and you're getting some other nutrients there. But it is very sweet and should be something that, we don't just sit down and eat handfuls of dates. And then there's stevia. Stevia is from a plant leaf, and that has no calories and tastes sweeter than sugar. Some people feel like it has an off taste, and it's safe. You can't use it in baking. And then I have that green line there, and that's where things sort of start to be less found in nature and slightly different. And the top of that is allulose, which is an interesting sugar. It's found naturally in small amounts. So it's found in small amounts in things like dates. So it has a biologic origin, but to get enough of it, it's really kind of tech produced. And this one is not quite as sweet as sugar, but you can use it in baking. And then there's sugar alcohols, and that can cause some GI upset. And monk fruit, the monk fruit piece is found in nature, but most monk fruit is also combined with sugar alcohols. And then there's things like aspartame, which is a probable carcinogen. So that's sort of a little bit of breakdown about sugar alternatives. All right, so sort of the next thing in terms of like specifics is meat and cancer. And that's been around for quite a while now, that processed meat in particular is considered a carcinogen. And red meat, a probable carcinogen. That is much less clear. The strongest link for processed meat is with colorectal cancer. And the red meat is less clear. All right, next. So how might processed meat and red meat be contributing to cancer? So what it appears to be is that these nitrogenous compounds, these nitrates and nitrites in processed meat that are added for preservation, they can create some nitrogen compounds in the body that can damage DNA. And then in terms of like the red meat part, that seems to be the problem seems to be more with the charring and the high temperatures creating a similar nitrogenous compound. So it seems that if meat is used in stews and things like that, where it's not charred, it doesn't seem to have that same impact. But again, not as much data for red meat as for processed meat. Next slide. Yeah, and this is just to put the red meat piece into perspective a little bit. If we think about the or processed meat and red meat, I guess combined, if we think about what the risk of developing cancer is for individuals who are smoking, that risk is about 86% and 19% for contributing to other cancers. And it's much less for processed and red meat. It's associated with about 21% of GI cancers and much less other cancers. But so I just thought it would be helpful to put that into perspective with tobacco, which is such a known risk factor for cancer. Next slide. And then alcohol. So last January, the Surgeon General came out with an advisory regarding the link between alcohol and cancer risk. And alcohol is considered a group 1 carcinogen. And so last year, the Surgeon General recommended updating health warning labels on alcohol, and that hasn't happened. And you see there, the picture shows that it's most associated with mouth, throat, so head and neck cancers, esophageal, some breast, liver, colorectal. So the American Cancer Society suggests that it's best not to drink alcohol, and for people who do choose to drink alcohol, to have no more than 1 a day for women and 2 for men. Men generally have larger livers, so they can metabolize the alcohol a little better. The World Cancer Research Fund suggests that it's just also best not to drink alcohol. All right, next. All right, so now we're going to move on to kind of where we are headed. So that's where we are in terms of sort of the general diet and some concerns about it. So what's next? Next slide. All right, so in terms of, and this is just a lot of words, but in terms of food pattern recommendations, so the type of diet that individuals should be consuming to help deal with cancer, the prevention recommendations and recommendations for those who have cancer are very, very similar. So it's choosing foods that are high in nutrients, a lot of vegetables, especially dark green, red, colorful vegetables, fruits, especially whole fruits and whole grains and things like that. And then for individuals who have cancer, recommendations are avoiding excess weight and maintaining or increasing muscle mass, following general healthy eating patterns. And there is really insufficient data for very specific types of diets, except for plant-based for breast cancer and kind of a Mediterranean diet pattern for prostate cancer. There is stronger data for those specific cancers. And the reason that it's really hard to drill down for very specific cancers is that cancers are really quite different and unique in how they act and how they respond. Next slide. And so there's been many foods that have been specifically studied for cancer, but I think the really important piece here is that there really is no superfood. Plants are the ones that are most important for a variety of reasons, but all of those listed there have been looked at specifically for cancer, and there appears to be some data, but it's all within the mix of a healthy diet. And no plant-based does not necessarily mean vegetarian. So we will get to that later. Good question. Next slide. And here's the real magic for vegetables and fruit in particular, but plants also in general. And that is these phytonutrients. So phytonutrients are these compounds that aren't technically vitamins or minerals. You don't have to have them to survive, but you need to have them to thrive. There's no like RDA for these phytonutrients. And look at how many there are. And those are all found in different plants, and they have impacts on cell signaling and oxidative damage and inflammation and things like that. Next slide. And here's the illustration of how that impacts downstream signaling and how it can potentially impact cancer. Next slide. So one phytonutrient, and I guess I would call it a nutrient because we don't, or a phytonutrient because we don't specifically have an RDA for fiber either, but I think fiber is worth highlighting all by itself. So there's two types of fiber. There's soluble fiber and there's insoluble fiber. So soluble fiber, that will dissolve in water. The gut microbiome can digest it slowly. It helps us feel fuller. And then insoluble fiber, that's not going to be digested, and it kind of helps us move things through our GI tract. And the benefits of soluble fiber is that it can reduce the absorption of fat and cholesterol. It's fermentable by the gut microbiome, as I mentioned, and then that fermentation process actually creates some short chain fatty acids. And these short chain fatty acids, don't let that term fatty acid make it seem like it's a bad thing. These short chain fatty acids have some really important benefits, including improving the immune function, improving the lining of the gut, and enhancing the tight junctions of proteins in the gut so that things don't leak through. And then there are benefits of insoluble fiber as well. Next slide. Now we're going to drill down a little bit on some things to think about for the different macronutrients. And Rebecca, I can share these slides with people, right? I mean, we can figure out a way to share slides with people, like a printout.
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Cool. All right, so let's start with the carbohydrate piece there. And you notice, though, that there is overlap. There are carbohydrates that are kind of higher in protein. There are proteins that are higher in fat. So there's some overlap in that Venn diagram. Next slide. So carbohydrates are everywhere. Carbohydrates are in the vast majority of foods, but they are definitely not created equal. Some carbohydrate choices are better than others. Next slide. And the reason to emphasize vegetables and fruit, and I use that order specifically because we should probably be eating more vegetables than fruit. But there is an association with lower risk of chronic disease, including cancer. Vegetables and fruits seem to be associated with lower psychological distress, so lower anxiety, lower depression. It's higher in essential nutrients. It has a lot of fiber. It has plenty of phytonutrients, which would have antioxidant benefits, anti-inflammatory benefits, and like you saw, some potential cell signaling and immune function benefits. Next slide. Yeah, and what about organic? And every year, and it hasn't come out for 2025, but every year the Environmental Working Group has the Dirty Dozen and the Clean 15. And the reason I include this is that I get asked about it a lot. And is eating organic important? And I think there's a lot of good reasons to eat organic. If it's something that is excessively costly, though, there are definitely some it's more important to have the plants than to skip it because they are something's not organic. So in 2024, that is what the Dirty Dozen was over there. And you see that it's a lot of stone fruits and berries. And then the Clean 15, which has less pesticide amounts on it, are things like pineapple. And you're cutting off the outside of the pineapple. So it's often things that have a thick peel or rind or something like that. And again, they'll come out with it in 2026. Oh, sorry, this is 2025. All right, yeah, next slide. Yeah, and so I think it's important to sort of step back in terms of carbohydrates. And I think bread is something that we think about in terms of a common carbohydrate. And just sort of think about, what does your bread look like? Does it look like the Wonder Bread on the left, or does it look like that grainy bread on the right? Next slide. So I left one of my favorite bakeries back home, and that is Red Hen Bakery in Middlesex. So this is a combination. This is a comparison of different breads. So there's a Red Hen Baking Company, Sprout Nickel. It's got whole rye flour, some water, some sprouted rye berries, some sunflower seeds, and that's about it. Now, if you look at that bread on the other side, that is bread, but that would be considered an ultra-processed food, right? There's just not much of a way that you're going to be able to buy sorbic acid and calcium propionate and make that product at home. And then next slide. And similarly, when you go to pick out a bread product, it's important to read the label carefully, because in this particular label, they call that a wheat bread. They didn't call it's not white fluffy bread, so they made it sound like it's a whole grain bread. But look at the ingredients. The first ingredient is enriched wheat flour. That means white all-purpose flour. And then lower down, you see whole wheat flour. So if you're looking for a whole grain bread, make sure that it says whole wheat, or in the case of Sprout Nickel there, it says whole rye. And then you shouldn't see enriched something or another after that. And then don't forget that there's other ways to consume grains. You can consume grains as whole grains. It doesn't have to be baked into bread. So obviously oatmeal would be a common one, but things like barley and soups and buckwheat, which happens to have a lot of nice phytonutrients in it. And the reason to go for that whole grain is that the whole grain has the germ, which has vitamin E and nutrients, and it has the bran, which has the fiber. But if you're doing something like an enriched flour, like an all-purpose flour, all you're getting is the endosperm, is the internal part of it. Next slide. And then pasta, that's another common sort of carbohydrate. And I'm not saying that pasta is necessarily a bad thing, but we now have a lot of other pasta alternatives, like whole grain pastas, buckwheat pasta. There's red lentil and garbanzo bean pasta. The center there with those white noodles, that is shiitake or konjac noodles. And they essentially don't have many calories at all. And then don't forget about things that are kind of pasta alternatives that are vegetables, like spaghetti squash. Love spaghetti squash. And then you can also like spiralize and zucchini and things like that to have it be sort of pasta-like. And spaghetti squash with some sauce on it is awesome. All right, next slide. All right, now we're going to move on to a few specifics about protein. So obviously there's animal sources of protein and there's plant sources of protein. And this isn't a surprise to anybody what the animal sources of protein are. I do kind of separate out red meat from wild game. Sometimes people put wild game as a red meat because it is a red meat, but the nutrient content is quite different. And then similar to carbohydrates, though, not all animal proteins are created equal. So fish sticks and chicken nuggets and things like that, those are pretty processed. And you see the Velveeta slices there in the hot dogs. Next slide. And grass-fed meat can be more expensive than feedlot fed, but there are some differences in red meat based on where it comes from. And the biggest difference you see there is that the feedlot fed meat has more saturated fat, and the grass-fed meat tends to have less saturated fat and a little bit more omega-3. All right. And then there's non-animal proteins like soy food and legumes, nuts, seeds, and then the meat alternatives. And I'm a little bit on the fence about some of the meat alternatives. I think if they're used in, like, they're not used every day, I think they're probably okay. If somebody enjoys something like that, I think it's important to read the labels for things like Beyond Burger does have a higher amount of protein, but like some of the other burgers, look at it, they tend not to have a lot of protein in it, but this one does. Yeah, next slide. I think I have something. Yes, I do have something specific about soy. So people get concerned sometimes about soy products in the setting of breast cancer and sometimes prostate cancer because of the possible phytoestrogens there. And it's not a concern whatsoever. And soy food should be encouraged to be consumed. There's some data that it's helpful for prostate cancer and decreases the risk of breast cancer recurrence. So soy food is safe. And so that's a great choice. But ultra processed things like those soy not dogs, that's not a good swap because that's essentially an ultra processed food. So soy food, tofu, tempeh, edamame, soy milk, awesome. Next slide. All right, now we're moving into the fat part of it. So are fats essential? Yes, fats are essential. And I probably should have said this with carbohydrate. Carbohydrate technically is not essential. It's not an essential macronutrient. Protein is essential. And there are some fatty acids that are essential, in particular alpha-linolenic acid, which is an omega-3 fatty acid, and linoleic acid. Those two our body can't make. We have to consume them. And the type of fat beside it is where the source is. So omega-3 fatty acids, flaxseed is a pretty decent source, but the ones that we think of most for omega-3 fatty acid is fatty fish and things like that. And omega-6, the sources tend to be vegetable oils, nuts, seeds, and then arachidonic acid, egg, meat, and fish. Next slide. Yeah, and so a little bit about how saturated fat kind of works. So there are, you can have a saturated fat, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated. So a saturated fat has a full complement of carbon, hydrogen bonds. And there's no kinks in it. And so you can't see, I'm using my hand, sorry, but it can pack tightly. And so it's solid at room temperature, like butter would be. And then there's a monounsaturated fat where there is a double bond that is in that long chain of carbohydrates with hydrogen in between it. And that causes a kink. And a monounsaturated has one kink or one double bond, and that's liquid at room temperature, like olive oil. But if you've put olive oil in the refrigerator, it gets solid. So that would be a monounsaturated. And then polyunsaturated has more than one double bond, and it's liquid both in the refrigerator and at room temperature. And that would be things like sunflower oil, flaxseed oil. Next slide. So I think it's also important to remember that all fat sources are a mix of saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, and polyunsaturated fat. There's nothing that's a pure fat. So look at lard there, which is about 2/3 of the way down. Lard actually has more monounsaturated fat than it does saturated fat. I'm not saying that that's good, but just pointing out that fat is really a mixture of types of fat. And the omega-3 fatty acids on that graph are represented sort of in the turquoise. And you can see, and there isn't fish here, but you can see that there aren't a lot of, that omega-3 isn't all that common in a lot of different oils. It happens to be pretty high in the flaxseed oil. And another one that's not here is walnut, but yeah, I think that's on the next slide. So always a mix. All right, what about fats from animal sources? And so there's pretty darn clear data that saturated fat increases LDL cholesterol and is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So that is kind of not disputed anymore. And if someone is at high risk for cardiovascular disease, that's important to pay attention to. But it may not have been quite as bad as what it was originally reported to be in the early 70s, because at that time it was the trans fats that are things like that were in things like Crisco and things like that were mixed, lumped into the saturated fat intake. So it might not have been quite as bad. And then there is also multiple randomized control trials, so well-done studies that tell us that replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, so oils, lowers cardiovascular disease. So if you replace butter with something like, you replace butter, however, with carbohydrates, which seems to be what happened in the 90s, all the fat-free things, that wasn't a good choice and led to some negative consequences. All right, next slide. A bad thing. So for extracting with solvent fatty acids to omega-3 fatty acids, meaning if we are consuming more omega-6 and not so much omega-3, that can be a potential problem and be related to certain chronic diseases. Now, the current ratio that we're consuming with our standard American diet is 10 for every 10 grams of omega-6, you're consuming 1 of omega-3. And an ideal ratio is probably more like 1-to-1 or like 4-to-1. But is it the oil itself that's causing the problem, or is it the fact that those oils are found in ultra-processed food? That's the part that's really hard to tease out. It's probably the ultra-processed food more than anything. So next slide. All right, and this next slide is just to point out that omega-3 fatty acids, there's a lot of benefits. It can help, it's an integral part of all cell membranes. And if you have more omega-3 than other compounds, those cell membranes are more fluid. It can improve blood vessel function. Omega-3s are a precursor for certain hormones, can decrease inflammation. There's a lot of benefits. And you don't have to get it just from fatty fish. Walnuts, pecans, flaxseed, and other oil sources have fatty acids. And that mix of that jar with the black stuff coming out of it, that is chia. So chia has a lot of omega-3 as well. Next slide. So some a baseline quality fat to use regularly would be olive oil. And people have concerns about olive oil in terms of cooking, and it doesn't have as high of a smoke point, but it has a pretty high smoke point. And then if you don't like the flavor for certain things, or you're concerned you're cooking something at a little bit higher heat, there are other options like avocado oil, canola oil, walnut, grapeseed. Those are a little bit more specialty. Flaxseed oil, if you have some, and I like it in a lot of things, store it in the refrigerator. Because flaxseed oil can go bad quickly, and flaxseed oil that is kind of gone rancid is linseed oil, which we use for woodworking and things like that. All right, so next slide. All right, so now how do we get there? How do we sort of get to less windy and more of a straight path? And the key is lots of plants. All right, next slide. So how much? So I'm going to try to get into things that are a little bit more practical. So the how much would be at least 5 servings of not starchy, but 5 servings of vegetables and fruits. And so that's not counting starchy vegetables, and it's not counting fruit juice. So how much is that? It's about 2.5 cups. A serving of raw vegetables is about a cup. A serving of cooked vegetables is considered about a half of a cup. 12 grapes is about a serving. Depends on the size of your banana. It could be a small banana or a half of a banana, or an orange or an apple. So that is kind of the minimum recommendation would be 5 servings of vegetables and fruit a day. And how can you increase that? So you can consider including vegetables pretty much at every meal, or a vegetable and a fruit at every meal. One that feels a little bit harder to do that for is like breakfast. But if you have something like scrambled eggs, throw in some spinach. Would be a way that you could get some vegetables for breakfast. Keep fruit out where you can see it, and have your snack. If you are someone who snacks, have a planned snack of vegetables and fruit. And you can have other things besides the vegetables and fruit. You could have vegetables and hummus. You could have apple slices and peanut butter. And then when you're making recipes, you can easily double the number of vegetables in a recipe, and people don't even know it. And I don't know if there's anybody here that has youngish children. My kids have no idea how many shredded carrots they consumed, because they didn't know that it was in the food that we were making. So there's ways that you can increase that. All right, next slide. So is more better in terms of vegetables and fruit? And the answer to that is yeah, probably. There is an interesting study where they found that the cutoff for benefits for mostly it was cardiovascular disease, not cancer, but the cutoff for benefit, the kind of the dose was you've got to benefit up till about 800 grams a day. And that picture is just an illustration of what 800 grams looks like. And that looks like a lot, but don't forget it's spread out through the day. And there's an interesting, and I really trust this person. Her name is Eleanor Sinkowski, E.C. Sinkowski, yeah. And she has a online sort of a presence under the name optimizeme.com. And she developed this 800-gram challenge, which is really kind of interesting. So I stole this picture from that website, but I trust what she says. And so that's an example of 800 grams. Danish guideline recommendations recommend about 600 grams, not milligrams. Oh my gosh, that's a mistake. 600 grams would be minuscule. So 600 grams. All right, next slide, a day. And then it's important to eat a variety of colors. Now, if you're not eating vegetables at all and you decided I'm going to just have zucchini for all 5 servings, that's still an improvement. But sort of to take it to the next level, eating a variety of colors is useful because that's where all of those phytochemicals are. And all those colors really, those are the phytonutrients. And the different colors represent different phytonutrients. Next slide. But it is not just vegetables and fruit where you find phytonutrients. You find them in beans and legumes. You find them in things like coffee, thank goodness, and pomegranate and green tea and all kinds of nuts and all kinds of herbs and spices, oat-based grain things in particular, and then dark chocolate. And dark chocolate has as high or higher than most vegetables and fruits in terms of antioxidant content. But the same is not true for milk chocolate. It needs to be dark chocolate. All right, next slide. And then also, minimally processed foods are a great idea. And so bagged spinach, cut vegetables, canned beans and tomatoes and tuna and legumes, most nut butters. I like the nut butter that has the fat on the top and then you mix it in. And the reason I say pasteurized dairy products is because I live in the cancer world, and if someone is receiving chemotherapy, we still don't quite trust raw dairy or natural dairy products. But please include processed foods. Things do not, minimally processed foods, things do not have to be fresh. It's important to make the easy choice, the healthy choice, the easy choice, and that often is using some minimally processed foods. Next slide. And then in terms of healthy protein options, obviously there's meat options. There's the natural peanut butter that I like. There's salmon, there's nuts. Next slide. And how much? So how much red meat? And our our dietary guidelines, not yet released, which is wrong, right? It was released 2 days ago. So I'll get to that. I sent Rebecca these slides before it was released, but how much red meat? The Nordic diet recommendations are to consume less than 350 grams a week and to keep processed meat minimal. And 350 grams is about 12 ounces. To me, that's a fair amount of red meat. And then in terms of current US intake, our average is about 17 ounces. So on average, we are consuming more than that 12 ounces, but 12 ounces, I think, is a fair amount. And then, there's the Nordic diet, and then the Danish recommendations are less than 350 and 300, and focusing more on fish and including legumes. Okay, so the dietary guidelines, they did come out 2 days ago, and if any of you have seen them, it's an upside down pyramid. And the one thing that I like about it is that they do emphasize whole foods and de-emphasize ultra processed foods. So that part I think is nice. They do have red meat and butter and things like that kind of as something that's encouraged. Or at least higher. And I think clearly the data is that if you have cardiovascular disease in particular, saturated fat is probably not something that you should focus on. Next slide. A little bit more in terms of specifics. So this kind of is back to the ultra processed and the data that suggests that it increases risk of colorectal cancer. And so the cutoff that they found for that was about 50 grams a day. And so that's just an example of 50 grams of processed meat is 6 slices of bacon. That's a lot. I don't remember the last time I sat down to 6 slices of bacon. Or 1 hot dog, so you can sort of see what the examples of 50 grams are. Next slide. So I think it's really important to consider, especially if you're not doing it at all, to incorporate some plant protein. And this is data from Harvard, but an additional 3% of energy coming from plant proteins a day is associated with a lower risk of death from all causes. Now, again, this is epidemiologic data, so I don't want to try to oversell it. But there are benefits for including plant proteins. And it doesn't mean you have to not consume animal proteins, but including some plant proteins will get you some more phytonutrients, that will get you more fiber. It replaces saturated fat. So some ways to do that is to replace part of your animal protein with plant protein. So if you are doing something like having a meatloaf, it's pretty darn easy to include some like brown lentils and things like that as like part ground beef and part ground lentils, or to replace your pasta with more of a protein-based pasta like chickpea pasta. And to think about, so when I say layering in different protein sources in a meal or in a dish, if you have like a salad, you can include some chicken, but you can also include some nuts and seeds and things like that. And think about nuts and seeds for snacks. And think about including soy food. So that's what's on the side there is that is edamame. So edamame, truly to call something edamame, it's still in the pod. But if you take the soybean out of the pod, that's what's on top. And that is really easy to throw into salads and things like that. And then it's a good idea to find a few meatless meals that you really like. And then you can, cook them on a regular basis. And another website that I kind of like, if you're into cooking and want to explore plant protein, is is Rainbow Plant Life. And her recipes are vegan, but you don't have to do it vegan. And if you are someone who is reluctant about tofu and tempeh, she has some great tasting tofu and tempeh recipes. All right, next slide. Oh gosh, I'm over. Rebecca, is it okay to keep going a little bit? I'm almost done.
Yes, if you need to leave, head out, folks, and then we'll record it. So,
All right. So this is just a little bit about reading food labels. Now, ideally, you're getting foods that you don't even have a food label. So like a banana isn't going to come with a food label. So some things about the food labels, it will always have serving sizes. It will always have calories per serving, macronutrient content. And you'll see that the carbohydrate is split into fiber and total sugar and then added sugar, which helps you to discern where that sugar is coming from. Because I should have pointed out when we talked about fruit, that sugar in fruit is much different than added sugar. And when you are making a fruit juice, the reason that that's a concern is you're taking out the fiber, you're taking out also the slower chewing process and slower absorption. And then all of that, sorry, the last thing is that it's based on 2,000 calories. So some things to look out for on labels and some ways that you can be tricked is on the serving size. So in this case, that serving size is 2/3 of a cup. And I think maybe this was some sort of cereal or something like that. That's not bad. But one way that they can trick you is if they say that the serving size is 1/3 of a cup, they can cut down the serving size and make the nutrient content look better. And so look at the serving size and think, is that reasonable? I think 1/3 of a cup of cereal is not reasonable. And then it's got the calories, and then it has the total fat. Now, trans fat has been removed from, we don't, technically, it's not in food. It's not added to food anymore, but it really is because you can add 0.5 grams per serving, and you can round that, the manufacturers can round that down to 0. So there still is some trans fat in our diet. And then if you're looking at other things, ideally saturated fat is less than 3 grams. Ideally, we're keeping the sugar low. So there's the 12 grams. So it's 12 grams is a little high. I like it to be less than 6 grams, especially if you're thinking about having other foods that have some sugar added to it. And then fiber ideally is greater than 3 grams. All right, next slide. All right, I wanted to throw this in, not that we're going to go over it in detail, but the Mediterranean diet is such a commonly discussed diet as being a healthy diet. But people's interpretation of what is a healthy Mediterranean diet is so variable. So this is what a true healthy Mediterranean diet would look like. And this was in what was part of a randomized controlled trial, because it's not pasta and tomato sauce. So it would include a lot of olive oil and a lot of tree nuts, and include vegetables and fruit and legumes 3 times a week. And sofrito is just a mix of some vegetables and onions and things like that. And generally more white meat instead of red meat. And then yes, the whole wine thing. In this particular study, they only included wine if someone was used to drinking it. They never said start drinking alcohol, because there's no data that that's helpful. And then it lists what it is discouraged. So a true Mediterranean diet would have less than a serving a day of red or processed meat. It would have less than a serving a week of some commercial bakery products and things like that. So just this is Mediterranean diet, just FYI. Next slide. I think I only have 2. No, I do have 3. So this, if you're looking at your plate, this might be what a goal would be. That half of your plate be a combination of vegetable and fruit. And then a fourth of your plate would be some sort of whole grain food. And then a fourth would be some sort of protein, high quality protein foods. And you see that there is some tofu there, there's some chicken there, there's some meat there, there's some eggs there. It's a combination of different protein foods. And then ideally, water. You don't have to have necessarily milk. You don't have to have wine. Water is a really good thing to include. Next slide. And I think this is, yes, my Michael Pollan slide in terms of recommendations, which I think makes so much sense. Eat food, real food, not too much, mostly plants. And then putting it all into something a little bit more, less overwhelming perhaps. And you can't see the sand behind that, but those are jars. And the rocks are falling out of the one where you see all the sand on the bottom. So it's important to put the big lifestyle rocks in first, and then you can get all the sand in. So what are the big lifestyle rocks? And that would be something that's a minimally processed plant-focused diet, exercise pretty much every day, and I'm sure you've had talks about exercise, adequate sleep, and finding a way to help manage stress. So those are the really important pieces. And I'm done. So thanks for putting up with going too long. And we can make, I'll send you a copy of those slides. I can hang on for a couple quick questions if anybody has any. Hey, Trisha.
How are we doing out there? It's a lot to absorb.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I did it is definitely a lot.
Tim,
So
I actually do have a question.
I do too.
sure.
Could I ask you?
Yeah.
So, there's all this talk about microplastics, and I'm just wondering, ideally we're buying stuff that's, not packaged at all. But some things are packaged. Even, if I'm just buying frozen organic broccoli, it's coming in a plastic bag and the cooking instructions are to microwave it. What do you do about that kind of thing?
Yeah, and so I don't worry so much about the plastic bag that it's in. I do think if you can take it out of the container and not microwave in plastic. So the biggest bang for your buck is probably not microwaving in plastic, and to not store especially acidic foods in plastic.
Okay.
And then there's all of the like cutting board. Should you have like a plastic cutting board and things like that? Those plastics, if you are getting little chunks of plastic from your cutting board, those are pretty big, so those wouldn't be considered microplastics. But wood cutting boards are a good option. So yeah, I think the two big things are the don't microwave in it, don't store in it if it's acidic.
Okay, thank you. And can I ask you one more question?
Oh yeah,
I mean, I have a million questions for you, but I'll ask one more, which is you had a slide that said something about heme iron causes DNA damage. And, having been on chemotherapy and lots of other things, I have this sort of anemic condition and so it's recommended to take iron and to increase iron because I have so much fatigue and low energy and all that, shortness of breath, that kind of stuff. And I don't eat red meat. And so I don't know, like when you said heme iron causes DNA damage, can you say something about iron?
yeah, absolutely. So heme iron is the part of red blood cell where and it has a nitrogen component on it. It's what carries the iron in an animal product. But iron in plants and iron in supplements are not heme iron.
Okay.
And the issue is with the heme iron a little bit, not quite as much as with like the charring and things like that, but it's the high heats that can contribute to this nitrogen compound being created. So it's not the iron itself, it's the fact that the way heme iron, the way it carries it, there's a nitrogen compound that is what eventually can potentially cause DNA damage. But iron in supplements are fine. It can cause constipation, but iron in supplements are fine, and iron in other food products are not an issue.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Lucy, did you want to go?
Yeah,
Great.
I did have a question. As somebody who knows a lot about nutrition, I have to thank you. This was absolutely a fabulous presentation. Having had breast cancer now twice, and lost a lot of weight and made a lot of dietary changes. One of the things that remains a little bit questionable to me, I'm not vegetarian by choice. I'm omnivorous, and I certainly do, it's plant-based. How do I look at potatoes? Are they a vegetable? Are they, a starch? Are they, I don't eat them every day, but can I eat them?
Oh yeah, for sure. So a potato is definitely a starchy vegetable. So I don't kind of count it in the 5 servings so much. If someone didn't consume any vegetables and they wanted all their 800 grams to be potato, that's still better. So I don't want to malign potatoes. But something interesting about potatoes and rice and pasta is that if you cook it and then you refrigerate it, you create some resistant starch, which is not going to be as quickly absorbed as that fresh potato. So there's some data that resistant starch has some potential benefits. So that's a way to have your potato and eat it too.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anybody else have something to ask?
I have a question about mushrooms. I see a natural doctor down in Middlebury, Dr. Fresh, and she always recommends mushrooms. Like she's a big mushrooms person and sardines person and fish oil and stuff like that. Can I just ask you about mushrooms? Because I do a lot of mushrooms in supplements because I just don't think you can eat enough mushrooms that a supplement can give to you. Or is there a specific kind of mushroom that you can use in cooking that would I'm so sick of taking a million supplements.
Yeah, I'm torn about the supplement piece. Mushrooms are awesome. And mushrooms, the ones, white button mushrooms, cremini mushrooms, portobello mushrooms, they have a compound in them that's very similar. And I don't know what kind of cancer you have, but they have a compound in them that is similar to aromatase, which is a medication that a lot of people with breast
Oh,
cancer take. So it's similar to it works similar to an aromatase inhibitor. Does it replace an aromatase inhibitor? No. But so it's important to get that in there to some extent. Those are obviously ones that you cook. They're not medicinal mushrooms. So there are also some medicinal mushrooms that you can cook with, and those would be shiitake, maitake, and lion's mane. And so it's nice to include that variety in as well. And in terms of supplements, I think you need to be picky about the company. And you need to let your pharmacist know what supplements you're on. Some are what mushroom supplements. Some mushroom supplements increase risk of bleeding if you're on certain things. So need to be a little bit picky and also share with your pharmacist what you're doing. I like the company Real Mushrooms because it has components of the stock and the all parts of the mushroom. So that's a company that I kind of like. And if people are doing mushroom supplements, that's the one that I would recommend. What I don't recommend is when people are taking components out of the mushroom and putting it in a supplement. So things like beta glucan is something that sometimes people will take instead of a mushroom. But then you're taking it out of context. To some extent, the supplement is taking it out of context too, because it's not within the context of food, but more so if you're like taking something out of the mushroom and then just consuming that. And that is essentially a medication. But if you are having a judicious use of some supplemental mushrooms, I think that's fine.
Yeah, it's like turkey tail. Turkey tail mushroom is really the one that I take. And I drink this like hot chocolate mushroom ohm thing that has a bunch of mushrooms in it that makes me feel like I'm drinking hot chocolate, gives me a little sweet taste thing, kind of
Yeah.
fools my brain. But
Yeah.
yeah, I definitely was curious about that because I have tried the lion's mane and stuff like that. It's just hard to find things to cook them with.
Oh, hey,
And it's
Susan.
yeah, I was gonna say, you know me. But yeah, but Anemone Fresh, she always, and I do tell my oncologist and everything like that what I'm taking. So, but yeah, yeah, and it's so
Yeah.
nice to see you. I
Yeah.
thought I missed you yesterday. I was like, oh no, I was so sad, but I'm glad to
No.
see you and glad to see you're well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and Real Mushrooms also has that chocolate thing. So I have Real Mushrooms chocolate mix for when I want hot chocolate.
Yeah,
It's
and
pretty
it does
good.
taste like hot chocolate. So if
It
anybody's
does.
interested, yeah, it's OM, and it's a mushroom mix and it's amazing with
Cool.
almond milk.
Cool.
Kim, someone in the chat asked the cookbook, the vegan cookbook and author. I can write that in.
Oh yeah. Yep. It's Rainbow Plant Life.
All right. I'm gonna write that in.
And so, yeah, if you bring her up on YouTube, there's a lot of different recipes, and she has a really large cookbook now. Like I think it's called Big Food Vegan Flavor, or I don't remember what the name of it is. But Rainbow Plant Life will get you to it.
Okay. And then there's another question in the chat. It's through an M number, so I'm not sure who you are. But it says, I like the idea about red lentil or chickpea pasta adding jarred pasta tomato sauce. Where does that fit in? And then it says, are you talking about mushroom raw or can they
Mm.
be cooked? Same benefit. Do you recommend a book for these food versus meals?
Yeah, yeah. So a specific book, no. I mean, another one that I like that just came out last year is from the Doctor's Kitchen, and it's called Healthy High Protein. And I like that if you're interested in kind of having some animal and some plant proteins and sort of layering in protein sort of things. But really good question and point about the mushrooms. So the mushrooms should be cooked. And canned mushrooms, that's okay too. But I would kind of avoid raw mushrooms.
Thank you. Sorry.
Nice to see you all too.
Thanks.
Hey, Rebecca, I'll send a copy to you.
Thank you. And then I put my email in the chat. I think everyone's email because you got the invitation, but if you don't think I do and you want the slides, make sure you let me know. just send me an email. But I think I've got everybody, but I just don't want to miss someone in case, because I don't know who like Google Pixel or M is. And so just let me know. And then I'll have the recording up on YouTube and I'll send that out too. Thank you so
Thank you, ladies. It was so nice to see you
Thank
both. It's
you.
been
Thanks,
forever. Thank
Kim.
you.
Bye.
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 Well, be well, everybody.
You. You too. Happy New Year to you guys too.
You too.
Here. Bye.
Bye.